That was 2 minutes and 23 seconds for Ahmaud Arbery. If you're not aware and haven't been checking the news out, this young man was murdered by a father and son while jogging just because he was black. The 911 tapes released by CNN really do show that they just were after him because he was black and jogging in his neighborhood in Georgia. And they were arrested yesterday, but this happened on February 23rd. His birthday, I think, is this weekend, and they're doing some running kind of protests, like they're running in his name. But it's been a rough week for a lot of Black America and our allies, because even in times of COVID pandemic, racism has not stopped, right? And we understand that social determinants of health and wealth inequalities disproportionately affect Black America. But every time one of us is killed, another human being is killed, and not held responsible because our lives don't matter, it adds insult to injury. I mean, what do you say? What do you say, right? We can say Black Lives Matter, and we know that. Like Stokely Carmichael said, the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, that wasn't for us. That was for white people, right? It was for white people because they had to be reminded, right? Racist white America had to be reminded. We always have known that we're human, but yet and still, we have to prove it. So today, we wanted to start with just saying his name, Ahmaud Arbery. Ahmaud Arbery. I mean, there's a list. I could go down the list of Black people who were killed, not just by police, right? We know of 4,000 lynchings. We know of hundreds of Black men and women who get killed every year. And the list just keeps growing. How do we stop that? How do we stop that? Part of the work that we're doing here is to help people understand how to access their own agency to change the world, because I feel and know that at least one way we can stop that is to empower ourselves to have agency in a way that shifts policies, procedures, and practices. Right? You change culture, you change values, you change then behaviors. And nobody here, nobody who listens to my music are the people who do that. Maybe the one person who doesn't like the videos every week. But I get that. But I do believe that there are more of us than there are of them. There's more love than there is hate. And we have to not just believe that, we have to know that, and we have to leverage that in what King called the beloved community, so that we can make sure that these things stop, right? It only is allowed to happen in America because America believes that it should happen, and it will be like that until we change it. So we wanted to just say his name, Ahmaud Arbery. Today, also, we want to talk about Black music and Black power. That's an example of it, actually. When you think of Black music and Black power, you have to realize the role music has played in African culture traditionally, and we'll get to that. But first, we want to get back to, we want to welcome you to this day. It's an interesting day for a rough week. So thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us. And thank you for keeping the names of these folks whose lives did not have to end just because in our hearts. To that end, we will breathe and remember who we are as humans. remember our families, remember our communities, you know, those who have recently transitioned, both due to COVID and to other issues like racism. Um, and remember our ancestors and who we are as human beings in a human family. So breathe in, breathe out. As we breathe in, we're breathing all of the power of the universe that connects us to each other. And as we breathe out all the negative vibrations. Get that out of us so we can do the work that we need to do. As always, every week, we want to honor and venerate our ancestors. So if you put their names in the chat, we will call their names. And I will first play, before we do that, the ancestral drum call. Carlton and Gladys Johnson, Ashe. Lorraine Dickerson, Ashe. Carl Dickinson, Ashe. Charles Fisher Goins, Ashe. Hey, Mom.
If Dante could retweet his, I can't get back to it.
Dante, you can put those back in the chat because we lost it. That's it? Ashe. All right. So today's topic is Black music and Black power. It's a topic of interest not only because I play Black music and believe in Black power, but as a Black musician, I always hear from Black and white folk and everybody else, why can't your music just be music? Right? Why can't your music just be music? And what they mean by that, whoever says it, is, and it's been written, like a review said, his music is great, but he attaches all this other stuff to it, right? His music is great, but leave the politics alone and just deal with the music. But what I want to discuss today is that I can't just play music because I don't have that privilege, number one. And number two, Black music has always been functional. It's always been a tool of culture, right? A way of communicating identity, communicating history. It's been a part and parcel of every means of human activity, from celebrating births and deaths to war, victories and losses, to harvests that were great and plentiful, and harvests that weren't, to invoking the ancestors and the universe and the elements for whatever we need in that moment, whether it's rain or a blessing. So our music has always been functional, number one. Number two, Max Roach said, the musician is the chronicler of his time. Right. So if I'm going to follow in the footsteps of great Black musicians in the American context, I also have to create functional music, which is why we started with Ahmaud Arbery and naming him and dedicating that 2 minutes and 23 seconds to his memory. And as a means of cultural memory, it's not just him. Right. We celebrate Ida B. Wells and Nicole Hannah-Jones, Black women, journalists who won the Pulitzer Prize, right? Nicole Hannah-Jones curated and published through the New York Times the 1619 Project. She won a Pulitzer Prize for that, and she has been attacked in the media for that work, right? Because she's telling our story, just like Ida B. Wells, who 50 plus years before Rosa Parks won a lawsuit against a train company, and nobody really celebrates that. She fought for women's rights to vote and suffrage, but she herself couldn't vote. She used the power of the pen to fight against and elevate the awareness of lynching. And she was so badass that she walked down to Mississippi into a jail. She didn't walk down to Mississippi. She walked into a jail in Mississippi to free 2 Black men at the risk of her own life. And she walked out of that same jail with not only her life, but theirs. And so we use music, or the artists in the griot sense or the Jali sense, we use music to tell those stories and to remember those people, those sheroes and heroes, and who we are through them. And it comes at a cost. It comes at a cost, right? In order to tell those stories in the context of an America that would kill a Black man while jogging, there's an economic cost. Those same people who will say, why isn't your music just music? Why do you have to have all this other stuff attached to it? Are the same people who won't hire us for festivals and concerts. They are the same people who will drop us from record labels because we're telling the story of Black Lives Matter or what have you. So there's a real economic cost to applying an African-centered approach to anything that you do, especially in the arts. But the game is agency and power, right? So we're going to talk about Black music and Black power and how those two things are connected, not just in my work, but in a historical context. Let me find where I am in my notes. Do we have more names? More ancestors to honor. Ed Bell, Ashe.
Edna Bell,
Edna Bell, Ashe.
Mike Bell,
Mike Bell, Ashe.
George Bell,
George Bell, Ashe.
William Bell,
William Bell, Ashe.
Charles Bell,
Charles Bell, Ashe.
and Danielle Bell.
And Danielle Bell, Ashe. Thank you. Um, so, in order to understand why the function of black music as it connects to and relates to black power and black culture are important, we have to understand the historical context in which it comes. So prior to slavery and colonization, like I said, all of music was functional. There actually in many cultural contexts along specifically the West African corridor, there was no word specific for music separate from medicine, dance, and magic, right? Those things were all kind of conceptually one thing. And the music, what we would call music, was not separated into false dichotomies, right? Observer, performer, or high versus low art, or sacred versus secular. It was none of that. It was communal, even though there was a class of people who were quote unquote professional musicians, right? All of it was communal, the performative aspect. So it's not like the Jolly would come do a concert and then they would get paid for the concert. No, it wasn't like that. It was participatory. People could clap. People could join in the dance. They could join in the refrains, just like in the black church. There's call and response. Somebody would sing a line and the folks would join in. And so it was functional in that sense. And it was almost always accompanied by some kind of dance. They told stories of great people. They celebrated great men and women. They told stories of the culture. They passed that lineage and heritage and narrative down to the young people. So they passed along the culture, transmitted values through music. Music was functional. And it was brought with us, stolen actually, with us as we were stolen into slavery. And it didn't change in terms of function, but the way that function manifested changed as we transitioned from culturally African to what Ahmaud Arbery Baraka called the blues people. In that context of slavery, the music had to represent something different, where in the African, pre-colonial African context, it only had to remind us, help us shape who we were. In the enslaved context, it had to do that, plus it had to protect us. It had to do that, plus it had to shield our humanity. So we developed techniques of function like double entendre, right? This is shown or best modeled in spirituals like wade in the water, children, where the water really represented a way to escape or hide your scent from the dogs, right? Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot. You know, the chariot was coming to take you home to freedom across the River Jordan. Get on board, little children, get on board, or follow the drinking gourd. These all had messages for the initiated. Right. So if you have kids who use text language in their, now even in their speaking conversation, you don't know what those abbreviations are. It's a language that is for youth culture. They created it so they can have conversations amongst themselves. And so, the initiated, those who are young people, know what they're talking about. And those of us who are old and have a little gray got to use Google and figure out what's going on. Right. It's the same idea. So it became a form of subversive resistance. Incidentally, because I've tuned the drums the way I have, I can play those two spirituals. So I will play Wade in the Water and Swing Low, Sweet Chariot as examples. right.
Uh, Maria Reina Rosario,
Maria Reina Rosario, Ashe.
Juanita Guron,
Juanita Rulan, Ashe.
Carmelo Sambois,
Carmelo Sambois, Ashe.
Garciela Sambois,
Garciela Sambois, Ashe.
Carlos Sambois,
Carlos Sambois, my Ashe.
Rebecca Simmons,
Rebecca Simmons, Ashe. That's Mylene?
Mylene.
Oh, hi. Femergy's in the house. All right, so functional, right? Human beingness in Africa only. In the American context, enslaved Africans who became black had to shift the way their music functioned. And it became both a representation and protection of their humanity, right? And what's interesting, also in what became America, the psyche split, and this is shown in how our music split. Like I said, or in the African context, there was no separation between high-low art, sacred versus secular. That's all like European stuff. We didn't think like that. We think holistically. But here, we did have a separation, right? Our psyche split. And in thinking about that, I had to figure out why, right? If for generations we believed in the oneness of all, why is it that in this context we split? And I figured it had to be because we knew or learned that we couldn't present ourselves in the fullness of who we actually were. So we could only give a particular context a part of who we are. So we split in two, literally. The spirituals and the blues are the exact same music, but they represent two different sides of who we are. The spirituals represent our spiritual side, literally and figuratively, right? It talks of going home, which is a metaphor for crossing Jordan. So home to heaven and home to freedom. The blues, however, talk about the here and now, right? Who we are now, what we're going through, but not directly. Again, a lot of metaphors and similes. So when you hear a blues song and it's talking about a woman, oftentimes it's not literally about a woman. In the older Delta context especially, it's about the boss man, right? Because you cannot, it's a matter of life and death if you say to Massa, I don't like you, you're a punk, right? You can't say that. So you have to make up songs that talk about how much of a punk your master is in a way that only people who are initiated into that vernacular or that colloquial cultural language understand. So our psyche split in two and our music split as a result. And because of that split, we now have several different lines of music that function in various ways to represent the fullness of who we are. Along the spiritual line, you have spirituals, then you have, gospel music, and then you have contemporary gospel music, and that line of sacred music. In the blues, you have the blues, then you had, ragtime, jazz, quote unquote, jazz or black art music. Then you had R&B, soul, funk, hip hop, all of those lines. And all of those lines can be spiritual in the sense that they communicate spiritual values. But all of the sacred lines can also be quote unquote secular in the sense that the music that supports the lyric that conveys a spiritual message can be very closely aligned, if not directly related, to secular music. So we still have that unity in terms of our aesthetic, with respect to music, but in terms of what the focus is, there's a strict separation. That's not so strict. That's why you'll have secular artists thanking God for an award, but their record has explicit lyrics. You know what I mean? That's a representation of how that thing is won, right? Or you have a lot of gospel musicians who love secular music, right? Because it's just a manifestation of who we are. So when asked, why can't my music just be music? It's because I come from a tradition where music was not just music. And if I want to honor that tradition, I have to practice that, right? That's why I have to practice all the stuff that we've been talking about. When you are under threat economically and otherwise, because you're trying to tell your story or working to tell your story, then you have to draw strength from a different source, right? You have to literally source, your work in terms of how you pay for it from different sources. because the way the world works does not support the telling of our stories just because, right? So you have so many more African American artists in the Western context supporting their work through alternative means, whether it's a job or they're playing, pop music to, like, I write symphonies to support my jazz habit. I'll always make a joke about that. But the idea there is I have to do something in a predominantly white context in order to support the African-centered work I do as an artist. Does that make sense? So how does that work? I talked about how the music split. Now, how does it work with respect to power? So one way was just how I showed you. The spirituals helped us figure out how to find freedom, right? And it gave us a sense of agency. But even in that split, the music did not stop representing our humanity and protecting it. So one of the things I like to talk about before I play the next piece is related to how secular music in particular either preceded, coincided with, or reflected social movements, right? So if you think about it like this, I don't have to go all the way back because we don't have that much time. But if you just think about the modern civil rights movement until today. So it's not, to me, conspicuous or in any way coincidence that in the early and mid 40s, black musicians created a music that to this day, most white musicians can't play, called bebop, right? So in the 20s and 30s, big bands, which was created by black American musicians or what we would like to think of as black Americans, but we're still not enfranchised, right? Black musicians created this big band music. And white musicians, Paul Whitman, Benny Goodman, Sting, all these other musicians, they started to be more successful than the black bands because they were white and they had access to more opportunities to make money. The younger generation of black musicians who were playing in Billy Eckstine's band in the 40s, they were tired of going in the back door. They were tired of only eating at restaurants that supported and catered to black people. They were tired of playing this high level of artistry, but being treated like second-class citizens. And so, in part, they got together at Minton's on 52nd Street and created this new music in the after-hours sessions. Thelonious Monk, Max Roach, Charles Mingus, Charlie Parker, and Dizzy Gillespie, and others. And it came to be called bebop. And it's very complex, it's very individualized, and it's harmonically and rhythmically more sophisticated than what the swing-era musicians were playing. And the idea behind it was we wanted to create a visual aesthetic, right? So they started to dress differently. What now would be considered bohemian, right? The little caps, the glasses and the scarves and the three-piece suits and all that kind of stuff back in the 40s. That was the style. You look at all those pictures of a young Thelonious Monk, and it's that to a T. They created this rhythmic harmonic complexity in bebop, and they wanted to be seen as men and as artists, and they wanted to be treated that way, right? To me, it's not a coincidence that that happened in the mid-40s, and by the 50s, we have the birth of the modern civil rights movement, right? That's one connection. Two, 1959, you have 3 albums that come out that precipitate the more militant aspect of the civil rights movement that happened in the 60s. You have Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, which did away with the harmonic complexity in the sense of complex harmonic structures to every piece that created this obstacle course for musicians to improvise over. He stripped away that and basically essentialized it using only 2 scales for the musicians to then create their improvisations from, which made it more difficult because you didn't have to do math, but you had to create with another kind of math, what some Rob would call higher order thinking, right? Because you have fewer materials, you have more freedom, but that means you also have to be more in touch with yourself to create from the inside out, right? So he did away with the rules and restrictions and created new possibilities. So that was one, Kind of Blue. The other two even went further than that. They didn't even, the other two albums, they didn't even incorporate scales. It was what Ornette Coleman was, who's the composer of both those albums, Shape of Jazz to Come and Change of the Century. It was harmolodics, right? Harmolodics is a system of improvisation where the melody that is improvised is accompanied by harmony that is also improvised. So none of that is preconceived. There might be melodic fragments that are thought through and played in unison with the saxophone, who was Ornette Coleman, and the trumpet, who is Don Cherry. But beyond that, everything is spontaneous composition. And so that's even more freedom, right? Those records came out in 1959, and then the 1960s, the social movement elevated, right? And then in the 60s, you have James Brown, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. You have John Coltrane's The Love Supreme. And you have other records that started to be considered, quote unquote, the jazz avant-garde. So the rules were even being broken further. No strict tempo, which is existing on both Shape of Jazz to Come and Change of the Century and Kind of Blue. So the musicians evolve even beyond strict timekeeping, strict tempo. There is no set harmony, and in many cases, maybe not even set melodies. So they're completely free. Right? And then you have even the more militant and some would say violent aspect of the civil rights movement in the late 60s going into the 70s. Now, why do I say this? So the music happened during, before, or in response to the social movements as a reflection of our humanity and our power. Right? The musicians were taking power. They were creating based on who they were, who they wanted to be perceived as, right? And creating, as a result, economic opportunities for themselves in so much as they could, given racism, white supremacy, where other musicians who were not black could not take advantage of those things because they couldn't play in the same way, number one. Number two, this was disrupted, I would argue, by disco. Right? So if you think about it, you have the evolution of the civil rights movement, you have the evolution of this music that is bringing folks in and together and helping them realize, again, who they are and their power and their community because of this shared experience. And when disco hit, all of that stopped. By the mid to late 70s, all of the Black Panthers were either in jail, exiled, or dead. King, Malcolm, Medgar, dead, right? The civil rights movement was done, and the music that accompanied that zeitgeist, that vibration, had shifted. Even Earth, Wind, and Fire had to do Boogie Wonderland. It's a disco song, right? I'm not saying there's a problem with disco. What I am saying that music in and of itself shifted the vibration, right? And we had to create something new. That new thing was hip hop. And if you think about hip hop, it did the same thing. It grew up, it was birthed, it grew up during the mass incarceration environment, right? Where schools, public schools were being defunded and music programs were taken away. And the crack epidemic was prevalent, right? There's on Ava DuVernay's 13th documentary, there's this confusing clip of Ronald Reagan says the economy is doing well, but poverty is growing at the same time. How can the economy be doing well, but poverty is growing? Well, we just lived through that. We're living through that now, right? So it's doing well for the 1%, but not for everybody else. Hip hop is growing up and birthed in this time, and it gives rise to a new youth movement by the 90s. 1988, the best year for hip hop ever. Every album is a banger. Go Google it. Check it out. Even the sad records in 1988 are arguably artistically better than the records now because the music as a whole was maturing. It had become conscious, it had become spiritual, and it had become political. But it also was fun. You had Slick Rick and you had Public Enemy, right? You had KRS-One and you had Luther Campbell, Luke, right? So you had all of this stuff going on that represented the fullness of who we were. And the music was disrupted again. I'm going to play something else and I'll get to that. So, bebop, as an example, leads to modal music, leads to quote unquote free bop or free blues of Ornette Coleman, leads to avant-garde music, all coinciding with preceding or reflecting the civil rights movement was happening on the ground. Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker and Malcolm X and all those folks, right? Hip hop, 1988, golden age, right? It started then into the 90s, and you have youth culture. This is when I was a teenager. You know, we're wearing posse patches with Africa in the middle and Malcolm X hats and cross colors and FUBU, for us, by us, and Carl Kanai if you could afford it. I remember my Uncle Dale had some fly Carl Kanai boots. But we were wearing clothes by black designers. We were wearing clothes that represented blackness. We were all about education, Fat Farm, Rockaware, all that stuff. Hip hop culture was an expression of beauty. It was an expression of blackness. It was black is beautiful in the 90s, like black was beautiful in the 60s with Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, right? It gets disrupted again, right? Yes, in the 80s we had NWA. Nobody considered NWA gangster music. NWA didn't even consider themselves gangster rap. That wasn't a thing, right? When you look at stories or interviews with Ice Cube and Eazy and them, they were telling stories about what they saw in their neighborhoods. Yes, Eazy-E was a drug dealer. That was his life. There was a reason. He didn't just wake up one day and say, hey, I think I sell dope. He didn't say that. He did it because that was the economy that was available to him, right? My daughter is here, Layla. Hi, Lolly. She's checking me out. When she gets mad, she goes to her room and she throws stuff around. It's her stuff. It doesn't bother us, right? If she's going to break something, she's going to break something that's hers. What happens when you have a whole community relegated to a ghetto and they need to do something, either to survive or to express their anger? Right? They're going to hurt the things that are around them, the people that are closest to them. That's what was happening, right? And that's always been the case. White people do it, everybody does it. And so they're recounting, they're telling the stories that they're seeing in their neighborhoods based on their experiences. That's what our music always has been as a part of its function in America. And so it begins to grow. It begins to do all of the things from 1987, 88 to 97, 99 that black music was doing between 1945 and 1970. And then we hit the bling era, and then we hear gangsterism again, like as a format where the formula is you have to be about degradation of women. You have to be about who I killed versus what I did and how I'm bringing my brothers up in order to get record contracts. Right? There's a great documentary on YouTube by Byron Hurt called Beats Rhyme. Yeah, it's like I'll have to put it on the chat. I can't remember, but if you look up Byron Hurt hip hop documentary on YouTube, it's there, and there's a scene toward the end, kind of 2/3 through, where there is a hip hop convention and they're about to sign the next new rapper, right? And there's hundreds of people in this line, and Byron and his camera crew, they go to the front of the line. They have some dude drop some bars. They're like, okay, cool. They go to the middle of the line. They have a dude drop some bars. They're like, okay, cool. They go to the end of the line. They have a dude drop some bars. And they're like, wait. Everything you're doing, we already heard at the front of the line and in the middle of the line. You're at the back of the line. Why do you think you're going to be different? Why won't you rap something different? And he's like, the dude doesn't even respond to the question. He raps something positive, like conscious about police brutality. And he ends by saying, but they won't sign me for that. Right? So when we're looking at these young men, and a lot of times they are young men, teenagers, getting millions of dollars to call women bees and hoes and all that kind of stuff. And then the public blames that man, that young man. And they're not thinking about how that young man's talent and spirit was co-opted for $1 million to spit poison into his community. The same way they don't think about Eazy-E and how he could have been a successful Fortune 100. I mean, he became a successful rapper, but he could have had a successful Fortune 100, but the only option available to him before hip hop was to sell drugs in his community, right? So we use music to build, we use music to remember, and we use music to empower or to help us access agency, because I don't really like the term empower. It suggests that people don't have power, right? And that's why in every context you see it get co-opted and shift to something that's negative, right? But we can change that. You all have probably Twitter and social media. If you start tweeting artists and say, hey, we want to hear something that's relevant to us, that's positive, that's not about bitches and hoes and all this other kind of stuff, then I bet you within 24, 48 hours, you will hear it. If you say, you know, my kids listen to Migos or Cardi B or whatever, we want to hear y'all rapping about reading, I bet you they'll do it because it's about market demand. That's what everybody wants you to think. But the other thing you can do is support artists that I know of and work with who are doing music and creating art that does uplift us. Little John Robinson, DJ J. Rawls, who's a Columbus native, and he worked with Black Star. You can support Black Star. Talib Kweli has a great podcast. David Banner used to be a gangster rapper. His last record, God Box, is on a whole different tip, right? There are musicians out there, but you have to find it. You have to support it, and we can then leverage the power of that positive music to shift community. So, Mark Lomax. So speaking of which, we're going to leave you with some music, but again, if you're in Columbus and you want to support artists, go to gcac.org/make a gift to support artists who aren't able to work. You can purchase our curriculum. Thank you for everybody who has. I know my Uncle Del, Ikundayo, and a few other folks have purchased the curriculum. I hope you're enjoying it. And you can also purchase the suite. The purchase of the suite goes to support musicians. The purchase of the curriculum goes to support the work of Dr. Melissa Crum, who's gone around the country now virtually telling these stories with us and on our behalf related to 400 African Epic. Thank you for being here with us, and we'll leave you with some music. See you next week. Ruth wants me to play some go-go.
Shout out to DC.
Shout out to DC.